Deep in the folds of the Appalachian Mountains, steel rails once carried thousands of workers into towns that don't exist on any modern map. Coal camps, logging outposts, company towns built in a single season and abandoned just as fast. Today, the tracks are rusted, the churches are hollow, and the forest has swallowed the streets whole. But locals still won't go near some of these places after dark. Something happened here. Mine collapses, mysterious disappearances, company betrayals, and deaths the record books tried to erase. Tonight, we're walking into 9 of the creepiest hidden railroad towns in Appalachia and asking the question nobody wants answered. Why did everyone really leave? Number 1. The ghosts of coal country. The Appalachian Mountains stretch for nearly 2,000 miles, from Alabama up through Georgia, Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, and into Pennsylvania. For over a century, this rugged, folded landscape hid one of America's richest secrets: coal. And where there was coal, there were railroads, because coal is useless if you can't move it. Between the 1880s and the 1950s, railroad companies and coal barons carved dozens, maybe hundreds, of towns directly into these mountainsides. They weren't planned like normal towns. They were built fast, cheap, and entirely around a single purpose: extraction. A company store, a row of identical wooden houses, a church if the owners felt generous, and always, the rail line running straight through the middle like a spine. These were called company towns, and life inside them was strange by design. The coal company owned the houses. The coal company owned the store. Workers were often paid in scrip, a private currency that only worked at the company store, which meant a miner could work his entire life and never actually hold real money. It was a closed loop, and once you were in it, leaving was almost impossible. Then, one by one, these towns died. Not slowly, the way normal towns fade. They died fast. A mine would close, and within a year the population would drop from 3,000 to 30. Houses were abandoned mid-meal, according to local legend. Furniture left in place. Toys left in yards. Whole communities that just stopped. Today, hikers and history hunters still find pieces of these places tucked into hollows and ridgelines all across the Appalachians, so overgrown that the only way to know a town existed at all is to find the rusted rail bed cutting through the trees, or a crumbling chimney standing alone in a clearing where a house used to be. But it's not just the abandonment that draws people in. It's the stories that grew up around these ruins afterward. Stories about the people who supposedly never really left. Number 2. The first 4 towns. Let's start our journey with the first 4 names that keep coming up in Appalachian ghost town lore. Number 1 is a coal camp deep in the hills of southern West Virginia, one of dozens built along a narrow-gauge rail spur that once fed one of the region's biggest coal operations. At its peak, it housed over 1,000 people. When the seam ran dry in the mid-20th century, the company pulled the rails within months. Locals say the town's cemetery is the only structure that survived intact, and that at night, if you stand near the old rail bed, you can still hear what sounds like a whistle in the distance, even though no train has run that line in generations. Number 2 sits in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, a former logging and coal town connected to the outside world by a single spur line carved along a river gorge. This town has a darker reputation than most, tied to a mining disaster that killed a number of workers in a single afternoon. Survivors reportedly refused to go back into the mine, and within a year, the whole operation was abandoned. Today, all that remains are stone foundations and a rail trestle that locals say sways even when there's no wind. Number 3 is a former railroad depot town in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, built as a stop for lumber trains hauling timber out of old-growth forest. The town thrived for barely 2 decades before the timber ran out, faster than anyone predicted. When the company left, they took the rails with them, but they left the buildings standing, as if daring nature to take them back. Nature obliged. Today it's one of the most photographed ghost towns in the region, precisely because so much of it is still standing, half swallowed by ivy. Number 4 is a company town in Tennessee, built around a rail junction that once connected several small coal seams to a central main line. Unlike the others, this one didn't die from an economic collapse. Records show the population simply thinned year after year until nobody was left, with no single dramatic event to explain it. That slow, quiet vanishing is exactly why locals consider it one of the creepiest sights in the region. There's no disaster to point to, just an empty town that emptied itself for reasons nobody wrote down. For Townsend, and already a pattern is forming. These weren't just places people left. They were places built to be temporary from the very beginning, and everyone who lived there probably knew it. Number 3. Why company towns were designed to disappear. Before we go further, it's worth understanding something important. These towns weren't victims of bad luck. In a very real sense, they were built to vanish. Coal and timber companies in Appalachia operated on a simple, ruthless logic. A resource, coal, timber, sometimes both, was there to be extracted as fast and cheaply as possible. The town existed only to house the labor needed to do that extraction. The moment the resource ran out, or became too expensive to reach, the company had zero incentive to keep the town alive. This is why so many of these places have almost no permanent infrastructure. Houses were often built from cheap lumber, sometimes on skids so they could theoretically be moved. Company stores were simple wood-frame buildings. Churches, when they existed, were usually the only structure built to last, because they were often the one thing the company didn't own or control. And the railroads themselves were part of this temporary design. Many of these spur lines were narrow gauge, meaning they used a rail width incompatible with the mainline network, built quickly and cheaply because they were never meant to be permanent. When a coal seam or timber stand was exhausted, crews would often pull up the rails entirely and relay them somewhere new. The steel was valuable. The town was not. This explains something that shows up again and again in local ghost stories from the region. The sense that these towns were abandoned midlife, almost mid-sentence. Because in a way they were. When the order came down that a mine or logging operation was closing, families sometimes had only weeks to relocate. Company housing had to be vacated because someone else, somewhere else, needed the lumber or the land. People left behind things they couldn't carry. Furniture, dishes, in some accounts, entire outbuildings. It's this specific kind of abandonment, sudden, incomplete, economically forced rather than chosen, that gives these towns their unsettling atmosphere. A place that decays over centuries feels like history. A place that empties out in a single season feels like something interrupted. Number 4. Towns 5 through 7. Number 5 takes us to the mountains of North Carolina, a former logging town built along a steep switchback rail line that hauled timber down from some of the highest elevations in the eastern United States. The grades here were so steep that the railroad used special geared locomotives just to keep from sliding downhill. When the accessible timber was cut out, the company simply stopped running trains. No announcement, no closure ceremony. Workers reportedly showed up one Monday to find the rail yard empty. The town emptied out within the year, and today the old switchback grade is a popular but eerie hiking trail, still lined in places with rusted rail spikes. Number 6 is a coal town in the West Virginia coal fields with one of the more unsettling reputations in the region. This town sat at the base of a narrow hollow, meaning there was only one way in and one way out, the railroad. That geography made it incredibly vulnerable. When flooding hit the area hard in the mid-20th century, the rail line washed out, cutting the town off from supplies and from any way to move coal out. Rather than rebuild the line, the company abandoned the operation entirely. Families were essentially trapped for weeks before evacuation routes were arranged. The isolation of that flood event is still talked about locally, and some describe the site today as having an unusually heavy, oppressive stillness, even compared to other ghost towns in the area. Number 7 sits in the mountains of southwestern Virginia, another rail-fed coal camp, but this one is tied to labor unrest rather than natural disaster. In the early 20th century, this region saw intense and sometimes violent conflict between coal companies and unionizing miners. This particular town was the site of confrontations between company guards and workers, and while records from the period are incomplete and often biased toward the company's version of events, local oral history insists that several miners disappeared during this period and were never accounted for. Whether that's literal history or folklore that grew around a genuinely tense and violent era, it's part of why this site carries such a heavy reputation today. By this point in our list, a second pattern is emerging alongside the economic one: isolation. Nearly every one of these towns existed at the end of a single rail line, in a narrow valley or hollow, with one way in and one way out. That geography made them incredibly efficient to build and mine. It also made them incredibly vulnerable to flood, to fire, to being cut off entirely the moment the railroad decided to leave. Number 5. Towns 8 and 9. The strangest cases. Number 8 brings us to eastern Kentucky again, to a town built around a coal tipple and rail junction that, unlike most on this list, didn't fail because the coal ran out. It failed because of fire. A fire that started, according to most accounts, in the company's store, spread through the tightly packed wooden housing, and destroyed a significant portion of the town in a single night. The company chose not to rebuild, citing the declining value of the coal seam as the real reason. But locals have always suspected the fire simply gave them a convenient excuse to walk away from an operation that was already losing money. Today, scorched foundation stones are still visible among the trees, one of the few visual reminders in the region of exactly how these towns could end. Number 9. Our final and perhaps strangest entry is a former rail town in the Cumberland Mountains along the Kentucky-Tennessee border. What makes this one unusual is that it wasn't a coal or logging town at all. It existed almost entirely to service the railroad itself, housing crews who worked on a difficult, high-grade section of track. When the railroad rerouted its main line through an easier pass decades later, this town lost its entire reason for existing almost overnight. There was no resource to run out, no disaster to point to. The town existed to serve a piece of infrastructure, and when that infrastructure became obsolete, so did every home built around it. Locals sometimes call this one the orphan town, because unlike coal camps, it wasn't tied to a resource at all, just to a railroad's decision about which mountain to go around. Taken together, these 9 towns tell a story that's bigger than any single ghost story or disaster. It's the story of an entire regional economy built on resources that were always going to run out, in places chosen for efficiency rather than permanence, connected to the world by rail lines that companies could, and did, pull up whenever the math stopped working. Number 6. Why these places still haunt us. So why does everyone leave? The honest, unglamorous answer is economics. Coal seems empty out. Timber stands get cut down. Rail routes get replaced by better ones. Companies that built these towns never intended for them to last, and when the resource dried up, they had no reason to keep paying for housing, stores, or rail maintenance in a location that no longer made them money. But that economic answer doesn't fully explain why these towns feel the way they do when you actually stand in them. Part of it is the suddenness. Most towns fade over generations. These towns often collapsed within a single year, sometimes within months, leaving behind homes, furniture, and personal belongings that suggest people expected to come back. Part of it is the isolation, tucked into hollows and valleys where the only real connection to the outside world was a rail line that no longer exists. And part of it is simply scale. We're not talking about one or two abandoned buildings. In some of these locations, entire street grids, church foundations, and rows of home sites are still visible under the forest canopy, evidence of thousands of people who once built entire lives in places that, on a map today, look like nothing but trees. Local folklore has filled in the gaps left by incomplete company records, stories of miners who never made it out, families who vanished overnight, whistles heard on rail lines that were torn up decades ago. Whether or not you believe any of that, the underlying history is unsettling enough on its own. These were real communities, built fast and dismantled just as fast, by companies that treated both the land and the people working it as resources to be used up and left behind. That's really why these places feel haunted. Not necessarily because of any single tragedy, though several of these towns did have their share of genuine disasters. It's because the abandonment itself was so total and so sudden, that walking through the remains today feels less like visiting history and more like walking into a moment that got interrupted and never finished. That's 9 of the creepiest hidden railroad towns hiding in the Appalachian Mountains, places built to extract and abandon the moment they stopped paying off. If you've ever stumbled across a forgotten rail bed in these hills, tell us where in the comments. And if you want more hidden Appalachian history, subscribe. There's a lot more buried out here.